I have the pleasure to invite our next speaker, Tanya White. Dr. Tanya White is a graduate of our Jewish philosophy department here in Bar-Ilan University, is a senior lecturer at Matan Institute for Jewish Studies and a sought-after educator in Israel and abroad. Her doctorate in Jewish philosophy focused on the relationship between the post-Holocaust theology and postmodern thought in the writing of Irvin Yitz Greenberg. She is the recipient of Shu Fellowship for Outstanding Students. Tanya publishes frequently in various news outlets as well as academic publications. Born and raised in London, Tanya was privileged to have learned under Rabbi Sacks and have been mentored and guided by him personally. Her paper will focus on Rabbi Sacks' contribution to covenantal theology. Her lecture's title is The Place of Covenantal Theology in the Work of Rabbi Sacks. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you to all the organizers of this conference and everyone else involved. As we know, it's an extremely important and timely conference. I have no doubt that it will be instrumental in building the legacy of my rabbi, my teacher, my mentor, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. In this paper, I will argue that Rabbi Sacks's covenantal theology exists against the backdrop of earlier covenantal American thinkers, such as Soloveitchik, Hartman, Greenberg, Borowitz, and others. Though Sacks' work is punctuated by the zeitgeist of covenantal theology, I'm going to argue that his formulation of covenant takes on a unique genre of its own. My contention is that Rabbi Sacks's model of covenant extends beyond its usage by earlier thinkers as a model purely of divine human relation, and extends it in, even though his work is obviously analogous to these covenantal thinkers all along, what he does is he widens the model later to not just human-divine relations, but to thinking about the reality, our moral dilemmas in contemporary society. And he moves it beyond the strictly religious concern. Covenant is used as a way of addressing the challenge, very often of antithetical positions, such as, for example, modernity and tradition, or universal in particular, and it pushes us away, and this is what his aim, I think, is, away from binary thinking. So the paper is going to be divided into three parts. The first part is in the first part, I'm going to outline the historical development of Jewish covenantal theology in America during the 1960s. And obviously, that's in order to understand where Rabbi Sacks gets his covenantal theology from. In the second part, I'm going to explore the origins of covenant in Sacks's early works. And in the third part, I'm going to explore the second stages of his covenantal thought, which I think he applies to a far more universal agenda, and as a means of answering questions related to morality, to human freedom, and general dilemmas in our postmodern culture. So to begin with part one, the notion of covenant is obviously sourced to the Bible. Theologically, covenant expresses a relationship between God and humans, and this is based on mutual promises, mutual obligations, and it treats both actors as free and voluntary members of the contract, but obviously not always and not necessarily equal. Commissioned by many modern-day theologians, covenant becomes a motif through which an entire religious Weltanschauung can be built. It's a central motif in the work of many Christian and Jewish theologians, most notably in the last 4 decades. Why is that the case? Because I think the factors contributing to this upsurge, what I'm going to do is to understand why that is the case, why over the last 4 decades they have used that theme of covenant for their ways, for their outlooks, for their ways of thinking generally. Okay, so in part one, I want to talk about the evolution of the covenant concept, and I believe it has 3 elements to it. The first is the need of these covenantal theologians, primarily in America, most of them in America, in the need to introduce categories of human autonomy and individualism within the religious obligation of the human being, of the religious person. The second is the precedent of covenant as a theological trope in the work of Soloveitchik. And the third is the influence of covenantal theology as expanded originally by the Puritans in the 1700s and developed and advanced by modern Protestant Christian theologians in this century, who in turn influenced Jewish thinkers such as Greenberg, Heschel, Borowitz, and many others. I'm going to unpack the first two claims. The third claim I'm going to leave for now. That in and of itself is enough for a whole nother paper. I will just mention that Daniel Elazar is a very important personality on the third claim and somebody that Rabbi Sachs, certainly in his early thinkings, mentions a lot and is clearly influential for him. So the first two claims. The impact of the Enlightenment entered Jewish consciousness later than it did in the rest of Europe. American Jewish thinkers shouldering modern concepts of individualism, universalism, and existentialism, as well as moral agency, were compelled to address the role, or their role, vis-a-vis Jewish particularism. And this manifests itself primarily in the clash between the autonomous self, or as Daniel described it, the unencumbered self, and the obligated self, the encumbered self. And my contention is that covenantal theology acts, in a sense, as a means of balancing these dichotomous strands by simultaneously, whether successful or not we can debate, but simultaneously retaining divine authority and human agency. In covenantal theology, man, in all his individuality, his dignity, his equality, is given a central role in the divine schema. Whilst the majority of American covenantal theologians, such as David Hartman, Yitzhak Greenberg, Eugene Borowitz, even to a degree, and here someone mentioned Eliezer Berkowitz, who I think is very important, lean heavily on the side of human agency in the covenant, others, and again this is arguable, such as Soloveitchik and Rabbi Sachs, will favor a more submissive posture vis-a-vis the divine law and halakha in terms of human agency. In applying the covenant model in applying the covenant paradigm to modern Jewish consciousness, these thinkers have moved it, and this is what's really important, beyond its immediate biblical referential. And what they've done is to apply it to a far more comprehensive, far-reaching theological edifice, matching their specific theological agendas. I'm just going to use Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg as an example because I wrote my doctorate on him. He uses covenant for his post-Holocaust theology. He builds an entire post-Holocaust theology around the idea of the voluntary covenant. But he also extends the covenant for his postmodern theology. However, and in his postmodern theology, obviously, he places human beings at the helm rather than God in the covenant model. But throughout it all, covenant is still seen within the matrix of the divine-human relationship. Now, Sachs is critical of Greenberg. He's critical of Greenberg and other covenantal thinkers. In his early books, he very much forcefully comes out against them. However, withstanding that, I believe they act as an edifying force in his own theological project because their struggle is one that Sachs himself identifies with deeply. All of these thinkers follow the footsteps, in my mind, of one of the greatest religious personalities in America during that period, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik was the first to pose the covenant in a paradigmatical framework and to lobby it to advance a theological agenda. At least I think he is. And in doing so, he sets a precedent for the many in the modern Orthodox world who do that after him. And so this leads to my second assumption, which is that the earliest use of covenantal theology is found in 1956 address of Kol Dodi Dofek, of Fate and Destiny, where he actively solicits the covenantal paradigm towards a theological agenda, one even may say polemic. And my contention is that employing covenantal paradigms of Brit Goral, of a covenant of fate, and Brit Ye'ud, a covenant of destiny, that reach beyond their immediate biblical context and meaning, he opens the door for such constructs to be commissioned by his students in their own theological matrices. Moreover, the covenant, I don't know, I'm kind of not sure of time. Okay. The covenantal paradigm of Exodus, and this is just to show you, to give an example, what he advances as being the basis of the covenant of fate, is an exegetical construct, but it's not exegetically accurate. There's no explicit reference of the covenant in the biblical text of Exodus 6:7. It's a speech given by God promising redemption and slavery. And therefore, the only way to understand this apparent exegetical inaccuracy is to recognize that what Soloveitchik is doing in this essay is appropriating a paradigm of covenant towards a theological end, or polemical end even, despite the fact that it radically diverges from the literal meaning of its biblical origins. This homiletic rests on an artificial theological construct rather than an accurate reading of the biblical text. Now, these observations may seem immaterial, but I believe they're central to the understanding of the evolution of covenant as a theological tool. Soloveitchik's covenantal paradigm was both deeply influential and practically instructive for Sachs, and I believe it underpins both explicitly and implicitly his early and later works. In fact, I would go as far to claim that many of his early works, Tradition, Untraditional Age, Crisis and Covenant, and even Radical Then, Radical Now, are a response to Soloveitchik's question of what comprises Brit Ye'ud, which in a minute we're going to see what Brit Ye'ud is, the covenant of destiny. In the second part of the presentation, this leads directly on, I want to highlight the main areas of Sachs's early covenantal thought, emphasizing the influence of Soloveitchik. In his early works, Sachs seeks a way to house tradition and modernity, and we know that, and there was, I think even he wrote an essay, Tradition and Modernity, being Jewish by birth, and again this leads to what Daniel was talking about, being Jewish by birth and Jewish by choice, being an autonomous self and an obligated self. And he finds initial response in the covenant model, which I believe is profoundly influenced by Soloveitchik's paradigms of fate and destiny. Just to give a very, very brief background of fate and destiny so that we can understand the quotes that we're going to see from Rabbi Sachs, in Fate and Destiny of Rav Soloveitchik, he frames individual response to suffering and national identity through a parallel framework. He calls it an existence of fate and an existence of destiny, and he parallels that with, or extends that to a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. In an existence of fate, I'm passive, I'm acted upon as an object, I ask, why has this befallen me, why has this happened to me? But in an existence of destiny, I'm active, I'm a subject, I'm the agent of my own destiny. And the question I ask in my suffering is not why, but to what does this summon me? In a parallel move, he frames national identity through these two models. In Covenant of Fate, by dint of birth, and again this goes back to what we were saying earlier, by dint of birth, for good or bad, I'm a passive member of my people. I'm born Jewish, I'll die Jewish, and the conditions of Jewish existence are thrust upon me. But a covenant of destiny supersedes one of fate. Instead of forced fate, I choose to be an active member of my people. I ask, what is the essence of the Jewish mission? How can Jewish existence be imbued with meaning and transcendent purpose? The membership of my people is not imposed upon me, but rather a choice I make. I very much believe that this framework that influenced Rabbi Sachs very deeply, and on countless occasions, he describes a watershed moment in his own life, in his in his life in 1967, when as a Jewish student in Cambridge, during the Six-Day War, he literally describes it. He says, these professors and students came out of the woodwork. I did not know they were Jewish before, and all of a sudden everyone gathered together and started praying for the Jewish state. That he describes, and it is a paradigmatical moment of Brit Goral. It's a moment of saying, I am part of the Jewish people. For Sachs, it was the moment that would alter his life trajectory and force him beyond an existence bound only to national fate towards a calling of national destiny. And we know immediately after, or the year after, I think he goes to Israel, meets Rav Soloveitchik, and meets the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and that is the moment where he, in my mind, moves from a covenant of fate to a covenant of destiny, so to speak. The question of Bit Ye'ud, I believe, occupies Sachs on a personal and national level for the rest of his life. I'm going to bring 4 examples from his early writings that highlight the degree to which I see him adopting Soloveitchik's framework. Some are implicit and some are explicit. I'm going to actually skip this, in fact. Okay, I'm just going to read the beginning of this slide. This comes from Tradition and Untraditional Age, 1990. The Jewish fate, recent history has suggested, is indivisible. Jews have sensed the immense power of what Rav Soloveitchik calls Brit Goral, the covenant of shared history. And he talks about this idea of an external crisis, exactly how he describes autobiographically, pushing people towards him. The next slide is, again, he asks the question, I'm reading the bolder part, to find a way of bringing, how do we find a way of bringing the fragmented, splintered Jewish world into a common future? That is the task of theologians today. Was the Holocaust a tragedy or a turning point for the Jewish people? It will all depend on whether we see it in the lens of Goral or we see it in the lens of Ye'ud. The other 2 examples I'm going to skip for now because of time, but in Radical Then, Radical Now, even though he only, I think, mentions Soloveitchik once, if one reads the book, one understands that the entire book, and it was the first book that was really written for a lay audience, but the entire book is undergirded by this construct of Brit Goral and Brit Ye'ud. He asks at the beginning of the book, why should I be Jewish? I'm born Jewish, but why should I be Jewish? He gives a brilliant analogy of a library of bookshelves and says, today we can pick any book off the shelf. We can choose any life and any identity we want. Why should we choose the book that has our name on? And then he gives the whole explanation as to why be Jewish. So again, to me, he's moving between the Brit Goral and Brit Ye'ud. I want to move to part 3, and that is the section where I'm going to try and understand how, at the beginning, he sees a covenant very much as a means of providing an agenda of inclusivism, which has been spoken about today, and Jewish continuity. He sees it through a more parochial lens. But as time goes on, we see that he takes covenant and he expands it. And by expanding it, he is addressing much more universal issues. I want to say that, in a sense, what he does is he takes covenant and he uses it not just as a means of addressing the Jewish question. He also uses it as a means of thinking differently. I think Tamra spoke about the idea of reframing, and Miriam spoke about the idea of rethinking modernity. Covenant begins, he sees covenant as a means to telling us how can we think differently. In a very early essay in Ilan-Bar journal in 1999, entitled Fundamentalism, he defends what he calls the fundamentalist position against modern biblical scholarship. And he gives the position of modern biblical scholarship, he defends it from the Jewish perspective, and then he says, and I'm going to provide a third meaning, and he calls it a covenantal reading of the Torah, which is neither MBS, modern biblical scholarship, nor is it the defense against it. It's something totally different. And there I see the seeds of what I call his later covenantal thought, because he looks at it there through a dialogical lens rather than a logical lens. He understands that we don't just act covenantally, we have to think covenantally. And what I want to say is that the way we see him do that in one of his books, The Great Partnership, is that he uses the analogy of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. A left way of thinking is logical, a right way of thinking is dialogical. A right brain way of thinking finds truth in narrative, in meaning, in relation. We cannot have one without the other, but we cannot transpose one on the other. We can't fuse them. And therefore, going back to his earlier essay on fundamentalism, he argues that they don't have to be mutually exclusive positions. The Bible is neither one or the other, but covenantally, if we read it, in a sense, we can hold both in our hands together. In his very, which was quoted last night, the very famous quote, science takes things apart to see how they work, and religion puts them together to see what they mean. Immorality, in his final book, he takes the idea of covenant, and actually the very, very last thing, almost last thing that he writes, is that covenant is the central motif. My firm belief is that the concept of covenant has the power to transform the world. And here we see how what I've claimed, his second stage of covenantal thinking, is not just focused religiously and parochially on the question of Jewish continuity and Jewish existence, but has expanded much greater. And it is used not just as a means of acting or a means of marrying two dichotomous positions, but rather as a means of thinking differently, thinking with the right-hand side of the brain. So I conclude, this paper has contended that Rabbi Sacks's great theological achievements is his novel commissioning of the covenantal model. We situated him within the existing arena of covenantal thinkers in America who were occupied with questions of self-definition. He's also driven by this, but ultimately and deeply influenced by Soloveitchik's fate and destiny. However, his later thought in covenant serves as a way of creating a paradigm shift, a way of thinking beyond binary positions, neither that or that, but covenantally, of thinking dialogically rather than logically. And in doing so, he argues that we can find new and radical solutions to existing social, cultural, and political dilemmas. It should be noted this is not without problems. I'm not going to talk about them now. My time is up. There are definitely problems. He says in his own words, he walks a very narrow bridge. And yes, at times we can argue he may fall from that bridge. I had one more thing to say. I wanted to say something personally. Do I have 1 minute to say? No. Okay, thank you all.